Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're now going to discuss in this first segment of today's show Iraq and the United States and their relations, specifically when it comes to the deployment of U.S. troops in that country. We know that under Obama, he had deployed troops to Iraq specifically to fight against ISIS, or Daesh, as it's also known. There is seemingly now an agreement on the table for the withdrawal of all combat U.S. troops from Iraq. However, there will still be a number of trainers remaining in the country because the Iraqi army has requested and needs training, further training, to improve, of course, its own military capabilities. Now, we know that in the wake of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, as well as Mehdi al-Muhandis, both very important figures, both in Iraq and Iran, respectively, as military figures, there was pressure from the Iraqi parliament for all foreign forces, including the United States, of course, to withdraw from the country altogether. Is this because of that, or is this completely a separate issue altogether? Those are also very important points to discuss, because we have had Biden, of course, agreeing seemingly with Donald Trump's narrative and policy of ending these quote-unquote forever wars, as some people have termed them as well. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. And I join by Dr. Karl Kaltenthaler, who is a professor of political science and director of security studies at the University of Akron. He is joining us today from Akron, Ohio. Joining us today from Boston, Massachusetts, is Frank Sobchak, who is a retired colonel. He is also a PhD candidate in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Frank and Karl, thank you both for your time this morning. Frank, let me start with you. What do you make of this agreement between the Iraqis and the Americans? I mean, at this point, there is no timeline in place, but is this, do you think, more to possibly do with internal pressures that the Iraqi government is also feeling about the presence of foreign forces?
Well, Karl, thank you again for having me on. I really appreciate it. I think, really there's actually a lot to unpack here. And what is a relatively simple announcement, there's actually a lot going on. So I think, first of all, there's kind of political signaling that's going on from the United States. And it is both for domestic and foreign audiences. Kind of domestically, this is Biden's, as you kind of indicated, this is his attempt to kind of indicate that, hey, the United States' desire to end the forever wars. It is an effort that we are going to try to accomplish. This was part of my campaign promise, and we're going to try to make good for that promise. In terms of foreign audiences, the audience really, and with this announcement, particularly could be Iran. In terms of the Biden administration, also as part of its campaign promise, they indicated that they wanted to return to negotiate with Iran to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And this is kind of a part of and parcel of kind of a signaling effort to kind of indicate that, the days of the Trump administration maximum pressure campaign are over, that we are not really intending to use Iraq as a base of competition or even potentially a base to launch offensive operations into Iran. So I think there's a lot of signaling going on. And kind of at the same time, I think it's also important to kind of look as you kind of indicated, what is included in the announcement itself. In many ways, I think this is much more akin to the 2010 kind of announcement, kind of the cessation of combat operations and the withdrawal of combat troops, rather than the 2011 kind of go to zero complete withdrawal of U.S. troops. Because within the announcement, there were kind of, asterisks or like footnotes kind of indicating that, hey, by the way, the American advisors will probably not be leaving. Any forces that are assisting Iraqi forces won't be leaving. Obviously, the number of troops will probably be a lot lower, but there's still almost certainly to be intelligence personnel, logistics personnel, and special operations personnel still remaining, which at any time will have the ability to kind of over the horizon call in airstrikes or air support.
Well, what are your thoughts about this agreement? I mean, do you think in some ways that the assassination that took place on Iraqi soil of the Iranian general, that sort of did sour relations, and we're still very much seeing the ramifications of that?
Certainly the assassination soured relations and made it much more difficult for the United States to remain in Iraq. Having said that, though, it's soured relations with people who were already fairly sour on the United States. It didn't change a lot of minds in Iraq, because you've had people who've been arguing in Iraq that some kind of a U.S. presence there is important. It's important to continue to fight ISIS. It's important to build the capacity of the Iraqi army. It's also important to have U.S. forces there to be somewhat of a check on Iran. And it's very important to understand that Iran is now deeply unpopular in Iraq, even among the Shia population. So that's an important context to keep in mind. I interpret this agreement as not so much a major change in U.S. policy from Trump to Biden. It's more continuation than it is change, in that Biden is trying to continue to withdraw U.S. forces. So that's not really changed. The fact that there's no deadline for this, there's no specific timeline, indicates to me that they're not going to put a stamp date on that this has to be done, because that could ramp up pressure then on U.S. forces remaining from the Shia militias. And one other thing that I would add that's very important about this is Khatami, the prime minister of Iraq, is really stuck between Iraq and a hard place when it comes to Shia militias in the country. And the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces helps him in his efforts to rein in the militias, because then the militias don't have an argument that they need to continue attacks, that they need to continue to be armed. Because if they're not resisting U.S. occupation, why are they armed? And so that will put pressure on them to disarm, which is a major goal of the Iraqi government.
Frank, do you think it's a good thing? I mean, this policy overall, I'm saying, not just limited to Iraq, but this policy of less, I wouldn't call the word meddling. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people on the other side would call it U.S. meddling in the Middle East, but just overall U.S. involvement in the region, that lessening that is probably a good thing for the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I think certainly the domestic audience within the United States has definitely signaled that they have less appetite for military adventures abroad. And whether it be in Iraq, Afghanistan, or elsewhere, the domestic kind of political support for military operations is waning, for sure. There have been interesting moves within the U.S. Congress to try to even adapt and to try to change kind of some of the underlying legal terms under which the operations kind of have been underpinned. The kind of the concept of war powers, resolutions, and the kind of the original authorization, the AUMF, the authorization of use of military force, which was kind of announced which was approved post 9/11, which has been kind of used broadly to authorize kind of any conflict within what is known as the quote unquote global war on terrorism, or kind of any Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda associated movements. Kind of its approval, broad approval. There's even something that the Congress for a while has been reluctant to address. They are now even within the House of Representatives, there has been significant movement to revisit the AUMF.
Okay, so let's talk about the AUMF. Karl, I know we've discussed this before too on the show with you possibly. Do you think that it is time to revisit that altogether? I mean, I know there's already an effort by lawmakers to do that very thing, but do you think it will be Biden who will have the political courage to say, okay, this really needs to end in the current structure that it currently lives in right now?
Yeah, there's been criticism of the AUMF ever since it was created for being overly broad, kind of this blank check to engage in military action against a range of targets in a broad portion of the world. And it very well may be time to come back and take a look at that. Is that really necessary? Are we facing the same kind of situation that we were in 2001? Or even in, say, 2014 with the rise of ISIS. And remember, we didn't really changed the AUMF to fight ISIS, which was in some ways legally problematic. So I think it does make some sense to come back and take a look at that. And I think there's support for that on both sides of the aisle in Congress. Having said that, there are opponents to changing it on both sides of the aisle. So it's difficult to predict how it will actually work out. The AUMF is kind of a thing that the U.S. government has used to justify military action, despite its obvious flaws.
Yeah.
Will it be replaced by something better, more specific? That's hard to say.
We'll have to leave it there at that. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate both Karl and Frank taking their time out this Friday morning to discuss this with us. So we were discussing there the agreement that the Iraqis and the Americans have come to without a deadline at this point, interestingly, of course, about the withdrawal of all combat U.S. troops. All, again, needs to be put under quotation marks because we will still very much have, as both of our guests are mentioned, certain intelligence people remaining on the ground for sure. Both by the Iraqi government's own need, seemingly, for it, as well as the U.S. desire to remain in some fashion in Iraq for its own benefit and for its allies' benefit in the region as well, especially considering it sees Iran still as a threat and Iranian involvement in Iraq, again, under quotation marks, as a threat as well. Is this all to do with the Soleimani and Mohandes assassinations? I mean, maybe we're reading too much into it, but maybe we're not. Maybe Kadhimi is under a lot of pressure because of the Iraqi parliament and the bill that it had passed in the wake of those assassinations. And maybe this is all a result, direct result of all that. And maybe it is time, really, for the U.S. to end these forever wars, as Biden has now said, and Trump before him had said as well. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss U.S. aid to Palestinians. Now, we know that under Donald Trump, he had gone quite strongly against UNRWA, which is the UN Palestine Refugee Agency, which provides a significant amount of support to Palestinians within the occupied territories vis-a-vis education and other such important factors. He had cut the funding for UNRWA, as well as for a whole host of other such support that the United States has provided for Palestinians over these many years. Joe Biden came into office seemingly seeking a more reconciliatory stance, if that's the right word, towards the Palestinians. So he has now restored seemingly around $235 million of aid to Palestinians, and that's just part of the assistance, I should underline, that had been cut by Donald Trump. 2/3 of that will go to UNRWA, and the other 1/3 will go towards a number of other issues as well. Biden's also looking to restore some sort of engagement with the Palestinian officials as well, and the leadership, which would also be significantly important if there is to be any move towards peace talks, even though at this point in time there doesn't seem to be any very strong move on the part of the Biden administration to restart peace talks, at least as of this moment. Let's discuss those issues a bit further, and I'm joined by Susan Akram, who is a law professor and director of Boston University's School of Law's International Human Rights Clinic. She is joining us this morning from Boston, Massachusetts. Joining us today from Jakarta, Indonesia, is Francesca P. Albanese, who is a lawyer as well as author of Palestinian Refugees in International Law. Francesca and Susan, thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Susan, I'd like to start with you, if I may. How significant is the restoration of at least part of this aid to Palestinians? What does this signify on the part of the U.S.? Is this just meant to be status quo, essentially?
This is, of course, a very complicated question. First of all, it's important to know that this is just a partial restoration of the amount of funding that the United States used to give to UNRWA, which before the Trump cuts was $360 million a year. And one has to contrast even that with the $3.2 billion that the U.S. provides yearly to Israel. So there's a real imbalance in terms of the policies, of course, towards the two sides. It is a step in the right direction. It's a small step in the right direction, but it is going to take a lot more funding in order to restore what has already been lost. UNRWA had to cut schooling, it had to cut medical services, it had to cut staff. Over 500 UNRWA staff were cut, along with the Trump funding cuts. In terms of U.S. policy towards Palestinians, we still don't have a restoration of even the status quo, which was, of course, the move of the embassy from Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That is a major blow, and there are other significant issues that remain to be resolved.
Susan, about what exactly then the next step is in this regard, right? As you pointed out, of course, there's a huge imbalance in between what the kind of support that the Israelis have gotten, and they've always gotten a lot more support than the Palestinians. But do the Americans, do you think, actually believe that this will be in some ways buying favor with the Palestinians? I mean, will this work this time around, considering all that has happened in these years?
Well, I think what this reflects is that there are more individuals in the Biden administration who are pushing for a more balanced policy towards the Palestinians. And we know, for example, Hadi Amar, who is a Palestinian American, is in the Biden Middle East team. And he has, for a long time, been sort of quietly pushing for, again, a more balanced policy towards the Palestinians. So I think what this is reflecting is tension within the team. And there is push and pull going on, and it remains to be seen who manages to push this policy towards Palestinians forward. This is not a public debate that's happening. It's happening very much within the Biden administration Middle East team.
For all of the criticism that Donald Trump came under, Susan, during his tenure, it seems, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, that the decisions he made vis-a-vis Israel specifically, and Israel-Palestine in some ways, that many on both sides of the aisle agreed with him, even though, of course, I know that the downgrading of ties with the Palestinian officials was not appreciated by some Democrats. But overall, I mean, that form of pressure that has come upon the Palestinians, and or even sidelining. I mean, when we remember the peace initiative that was brought forth by Jared Kushner, I mean, the Palestinians weren't even consulted in all that. Does this then mean that in some ways that, yes, sure, we'll be talking to the Palestinians, but we're actually going to continue what Trump already started?
Well, I'm not sure that the Trump policies had a lot of support. They had support in one, I think, increasingly shrinking segment of the U.S. population. There has been a major shift in the last 20 years within the United States in terms of public opinion. There has been much more awareness, and there has been a major split within the Jewish community, the progressive Jewish community, especially the younger generation. They have moved very far from the Zionist policies of the sort of established Jewish community. And so I'm not sure that that's an accurate portrayal of what has really happened. There has been a seismic shift in the public perception of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the United States. And I think we are now seeing some of the fruits of that. And of course, we have had for the first time elected congresspeople who are Palestinian Americans, Rashida Tlaib, and a host of now even sort of what you would have thought mainstream congresspeople who have moved more to the left and some to the center and some to the left on this issue.
No, I agree, and thank you for correcting, Susan. I do agree. I probably overstated that in that regard. If we may, for a moment, just talk about the realities on the ground within the occupied territories / Israel. Right? We've just had the fourth elections take place for the Israeli side, and we're just about to go into Palestinian elections as well. Israelis continue to move ever more right wing. Is that because the position is hardening so much on that side? Will that be reflected on the Palestinian side, do you think? I mean, I know we're looking into a crystal ball here and we can't know for sure, but do you think that the feeling possibly on the ground on the other side?
Well, it's really difficult to say at this point. I mean, you have to remember that the Palestinian Authority represents no more than about 33% of the entire Palestinian population. And because of the lack of elections and because of the perception that the PA has been too conciliatory to the Israelis, there is incredible disaffection among the Palestinians in the West Bank and even more so in Gaza towards the Palestinian Authority as representing them. There is an enormous gap between the Palestinian people and the PA, and I would say the PA has been very much hanging on to its credibility as a government on a thread. And I am not sure that the Palestinian elections are going to make very much difference because, as I said, there's a sense of that this government does not represent the majority of the Palestinian people.
Let's continue the conversation with Francesca, who's joining us from Jakarta. Francesca, tell us about what do you think the U.S. is seeking to achieve through this partial restoration of aid for the Palestinians?
Yes, I think that the restoration is overall very positive, and we might even hope for a full restoration of funds, which is all the more expected considering that what the Biden administration has just contributed to restore is even half of what was given before. It's interesting, though, that there is a press release, and also the Secretary of State's words resonate quite powerfully with some ties that can be seen as attached to this contribution, because the Secretary of State said that U.S. foreign assistance for the Palestinians serves important U.S. interests and values, and at the same time, it's important that in addition to providing critical relief to those in great needs, this financial support aligns, quote unquote, with the values and interests of the U.S. allies and partners. So I think that the intention, meaning what the U.S. administration aims to achieve with the restoration of funds, is to be read in between the lines if there were doubts, and it's a stabilization of the region, because critically UNRWA is in danger, Palestinian refugees is in danger, and helping UNRWA means also stabilizing the region and diffusing this upcoming danger. But at the same time, I do think that if this is what is behind the U.S. intention, very short-sighted plan, and is not going to lead to prosperity as the U.S. envisions.
Francesca, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there for now, but we really appreciate both Francesca and Susan for their time today, for taking their time out of their respective schedules. Susan was speaking to us there from Boston. Francesca was speaking to us there from Jakarta. We were discussing the U.S. or partial restoration of aid to the Palestinians. This aid had been removed from the Palestinians under the tenure of Donald Trump. UNRWA, extremely important UN agency for the Palestinians, the kinds of support it provides vis-a-vis employment and education is extremely important for the Palestinians, who continue to, of course, experience the occupation as well. And that doesn't seem to be an issue which Biden, at least at this point in time, is seeming to tackle at all. So, of course, we'll have to wait and see then what exactly significance that move of the restoration of aid the U.S. is hoping to see at this point in time. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss France, and we've discussed overall Islamophobia and the way France treats its own Muslim citizens for a while now here on this program. We're going to talk now about the French Senate's vote to ban anyone under the age of 18 from wearing the hijab, which has generated a lot of backlash. And that's not the only such measure that's included in the separatism bill that is currently under discussion and that may pass in the National Assembly as well. There's also other measures, such as the fact that women in hijab may not be able to accompany their children on school trips as well. And these are, of course, just a few of the measures that can be discussed overall, which are disturbing within the separatism bill altogether, which in many regards does, in fact, target Muslim citizens of France overall. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Hamid, who is a political commentator, columnist, and journalist. He's joining us today from Paris. Joining us from Boston, Massachusetts, is Dr. Jocelyne Cesari, who is a professor of religion and politics at the University of Birmingham. She's also a visiting professor at the Harvard Divinity School. Jocelyne and Hamid, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Jocelyne, let me start with you. What do you make of the way that and the direction in which France has been moving recently, and now these details that have come out of the separatism bill regarding hijab?
So this is really worrisome, but at the same time, it is part of this ongoing suspicion of the French vis-à-vis Islamic signs of religiosity in the public space. And, you know, the debate on the hijab started in 1989 and never really stopped, to the point that you have this law of 2004 that prohibits religious signs, but we know that it was targeting and still targeting the hijab primarily, and the prohibition was in public schools. But since 2004, there have been a continuous push to also limit the dress code, Islamic dress code, in other public space. There were stories of mothers going with their children to get married in the city hall and being barred from entering the city hall because they were wearing the hijab. So the situation is very worrisome because it's a continuous erosion of religious freedom. And there are two major reasons for that. The first one, I would say the more deep down ingrained, is the suspicion and I would say fear of the French vis-à-vis the visibility of all religions. And for Muslims, they have a second issue, which is most of the piety or signs of Islamic piety are unfortunately associated with international battles of violence. And this is something that is also increasing the fear of Islam. So in other words, you have the extreme French secularism or laïcité that has pushed back outside the public space all signs of religion. Everybody has been concerned in this regard, but you add to that the fact that for Islam, all these signs are also signs of uncivism and even more insecurity. That's what I've called the securitization of Islam. Yeah. And we are right in it. And when I left France a few years back or 2 decades back, I said, this is not going to end, and this has been going on and on. So this is really, really worrisome, and it's very hard on all Muslims, even if they don't wear the hijab, actually.
Indeed. Hamid, what are your thoughts on this? Because as Jocelyne there said, it's not necessarily just about the women who choose to wear the hijab or not, right? I mean, this is an all-out almost targeting, right, of minorities, especially Muslims.
As you previously mentioned in your introduction, Macron government is assuming that all Muslim women in headscarves are oppressed and ignorant. The women, the French Muslim women cannot be empowered by taking away their autonomy and free will and the right to choose. And I believe that this step is very dangerous. The Islamophobia in France started after September 11, when the United Nations have been attacked, as we know altogether. So I believe that this step is dangerous, and it gives a very bad message to the Muslim world. France's relationship with the veil has been fractious for a while now. As you know, the latest drive to ban the hijab for everyone under the age of 18 part of, as we mentioned, the law, the separatism bill stems from a movement. And this is, as I said previously, have been growing in 1911. So in 9/11, sorry. So I believe that this law is targeting the Muslim women and taking their own right, and also is a symbol, a bill to ban religious symbol from schools. And I believe that today it's a very dangerous steps for the Muslim lords and also for the economic ties between France and the Muslim lords. I believe that today the French government is going to failure, and he doesn't have any proposal for the 2022. The stakes for the Emmanuel Macron is important. He wants to be re-elected for 2022. As you know, there is the next election in France, the next presidential election is in 2022. Macron, as a strategist, wants to be re-elected. He was the new candidate when he had been elected in 2022, in 2017. So this was a new phase for the French generation, and particularly the regeneration. So Macron has been facing now with many challenges in France, such as the economic crisis, such as his failure, his political.
Okay, so if I may come in, Hamid, you made some very good points there. Jocelyne, I wanted to put that to you because I wonder why now, as you've said, that the issue of hijab in France and religious symbols in public has been something that's been debated for quite a number of years now. So why choose in the year 2021 to go down this route? Is it, as Hamid there mentioned, as many people have mentioned, that this is actually all politics more than actually talking about, you know, the freedoms and religious symbols that have been debated, that this is more about Macron realizing that, for example, the support for Le Pen and her party has grown significant enough that that's now a threat to him, and so he needs to be ever more right-wing as well?
Yeah, that's definitively part of the strategy, electoral strategy. But again, Macron doesn't do it on his, I mean, he's not the only one. The use of anti-Islamic rhetoric and measures have been done by all governments, right, left. That's the problem here. Even if there were no election, there would be a continuous suspicion and discourse against Islam. Of course, it's easy to use it electorally, because all pollings and surveys show that the French consider Islam as a threat. So it's very, very easy when you do not have results in other areas like economy or even the COVID crisis to take Islam as a way to create this kind of cohesion and consensus. But again, I'm not saying it's one element, but it's not the only one. Otherwise, you don't explain why for 20 years this has been going on. I mean, there is something here deep down, and that's why it's easy to use to intensify the fear, and the fear is to be addressed. Otherwise, we're going to keep on piling on this kind of restriction up to the point that we're going to have to question the democratic feature of France. I think this is really serious. I'm happy that finally the measure that is discussed on banning the hijab has created a protest, because until now there were very little protests. Except the Muslims, and they were never really heard. So I'm happy to see that for the first time, these extreme measures are creating some kind of popular reaction.
You know, on the topic of religious symbols, right? And I think we've discussed this before. Do you think that other people of different faiths also realize that it's a slippery slope, right? That today it's the hijab, but tomorrow it could be the Jewish skull cap. Tomorrow it could be the Sikh turban. You know, we could be talking about even Christian crosses, etc. I mean, all of those things could very well be threatened if they're not already threatened by such measures, right?
Yes, of course. As you said, I do agree. I believe that it's not about just also the Muslim women, about the hijab, but it's also about the whole minority, the religious symbol, and particularly for also the Jewish community and also the Christian, which, for example, wears a cross or the hijab as well, the veil. Some French Christians wear the hijabs. So, but I believe it is also important, and I would like to come back what he said previously, your guest, it is important to understand that such policies in France today are not recent phenomenon. Discrimination against Muslims, especially women, has been stately enforced in the name of the law and order and national integrity for some times. And also the most recent proposed ban is just another step to take away the Muslim, the French Muslim lady. We have a paradox in the speech of the Macron presidency. When Macron had said, when he delivered his speech, when he said that we wanted the Muslim community, he wanted that to be integrated, more integrated. But at the same time, he excluded the French Muslim community. And this is also rooted in the imperialistic legacy of France, where for part of 20th century, it occupied many Muslim majority historically, as you know, lands in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Arabic world. And during this period, I would like to say for our public audience that there was also a drive to separate Islamic symbol historically and also practices from the oppressed area by banning the veil and Arabic language. Don't remember, from the public sphere, the colonial mindset has continued in France. We've seen that and has been the roots of the blatant Islamophobia in the state. And that is why also, that is why today the mentality of the French government, and I believe today the Muslim community and the Muslim world has to take steps against this discrimination, particularly against the women who are discriminated. I salute the Prime Minister from Pakistan and also the President of Erdogan, and also other Muslim leaders that condemn the Macron attitude when he said that Islam is in crisis. So this is not something which is new in France.
Right.
It has been for a long time, and during also the colonial period in France.
Okay, so Jocelyne, we're quickly running out of time, so I wanted to give you the final word. Does this all, do you think, also make sense when we look at France's relationship with its own minorities overall? So I'm not just talking about the Muslims right now. I'm not talking about just people of different faiths as well, but just people of color as well, right? So we've had issues of, for example, darker skinned people, or if we're completely honest, black people within France and black citizens of France, and the way that they're treated by police. There have been a number of cases over these years as well. So do you think all of this put together then creates this one atmosphere that possibly minorities overall and the vision for them in France at this point in time doesn't look very positive?
Yes, that again, there are two elements in what you're saying. The first one is all statistics and surveys show that since 9/11, the French government and other European governments had increased discrimination against all religious minorities. But the Muslims come on top, because the Muslims are victims of two types of discrimination: governmental, and this is an example, but also social, when people are abusing Muslims in the social relations, while other minorities in France are mostly discriminated socially, but the government is trying to maintain some kind of equality or rule of law. So this is very hard for all Muslims. Socially, governmentally, there are continuous attacks. At the same time, why this focus on Muslims? Because they carry in France and across Europe other features that make them, I would say, that pain them negatively. One is indeed, as you say, the immigration question, the post-colonial origin, the fact that also in France they are seen as an ethnicity or race. Most of them come from North Africa. So even if you are not an observant young man from Algeria, you're going to get into trouble with the police. And because there is all this colonial and post-colonial perception, and also because they belong to, or they reside in very disenfranchised urban areas. So people have put this together. You are Muslim, so you are an immigrant, so we have problem with you. You are an ethnic and or racial minority, and you create problems in the ghettos and economic problems. And on top of that, now everything is define in Islamic terms. That's the most dangerous thing that can happen. Nobody makes the difference anymore. So that plus indeed the I would say centuries of fear and suspicion of the French political culture against religion that goes back to the fact, and I will finish on that, to the fact that for the French, religion is problem because of the traumatic experience with the Catholic Church that always mingled with the state and was anti-democratic, anti-republic. And so the discourse has been transmitted from generation to generation. The Catholics have adjusted to that. It took them half a century, so it was not an easy thing. But the mentality is still there. The visibility of religion in public space is trouble. And when you add all these other features I just described, it creates this huge suspicion and I would say phobia in all aspects.
We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Jocelyne and Hamid for taking their time out of their busy schedules to speak to us this Friday, sharing their insight with us about the French Senate and its vote to essentially ban the hijab for under 18-year-olds, and secondly, for also mothers who possibly want to accompany their children on school trips. And that's just a few of the measures that are included within this anti-separatism bill that is set to pass in the National Assembly soon. I mean, it seems in all regards that it will. The country ever more right-wing in this regard when it comes to religious symbols used in public spaces, and in the targeting line right now are really Muslims, if we're completely honest, as Jocelyne and Hamid both there pointed out. What does this say about the credentials of France as a free country? What does it say about the choice of a woman to dress as she so wishes, which France, I would imagine, would hold itself up as a moral authority to claim that, in fact, it gives a woman the choice to dress as per her wishes. So where does that then fit into this narrative and reality now on the ground there in France? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.